Hello class, welcome to week 3 of Experience Design 1. In today's lecture, we're going to talk about empathy. Or, what is empathy and how does it apply to experience design? We'll be talking about empathy mapping, which is something we're going to work on this week in class. Point of view statements, which kind of summarize your learnings from empathy mapping, and affinity mapping, which is another research technique used in experience design. What is empathy? Well, the literal dictionary definition of empathy is the action of understanding, being aware of, being sensitive to, and vicariously experiencing the feelings, thoughts, and experience of another of either the past or present without having the feelings, thoughts, and experience fully communicated in an objective manner. Well, that's a very wordy way of saying empathy is the ability to sense other people's emotions coupled with the ability to imagine what somebody else might be thinking or feeling. So, if you pass somebody in the hallway and they look sad, you may understand their feelings because you felt sad before and you can recognize by their expression what they're thinking and feeling in that moment. Did you ever have the sensation that when you're watching somebody do something, say serve a tennis ball or get pricked by a needle, and you can just feel exactly what they must be feeling as if you were in their shoes? That's empathy. This one I find even more relevant. Do you ever cringe when you see somebody else doing something cringy? This one I think strikes home more because if you ever do something that makes you feel cringe, it's a really deeply rooted feeling. It sticks with you forever. I can think back to times when I was in, high school where I did something and was very embarrassed by it. Whether it's public speaking or just making, a fool of myself. And when I think back to those times, I still feel the intensity of the feeling in that moment. So I think when we see somebody else do something that's embarrassing, we actually cringe ourselves. We feel that feeling even though it's happening to somebody else. And why is that? Well, science in the last few decades have discovered something called mirror neurons. They're neurons in our brain, and they're the things that are actually responsible for us feeling a sense of empathy. Um, these neurons fire when we see somebody doing or feeling something we have done or felt before. So, what are the design benefits of empathy? Well, we understand our customers better. While talking, observing, and taking interviews, we understand better what is left unspoken. So sometimes people will tell you something, but they won't actually say the thing that's on their mind, and you might be able to infer that because you have empathy for the person. It helps us see more clearly the perception of our own words and actions on other people's actions. We deal with conflicts easier. Obviously, if you can sense what the person you're having conflict with is feeling internally, you're going to be in a better position to be able to deal with that conflict in a way that's uh, best for both participants. It improves our communication overall. That's very true. We understand people around us. If we know what's important to them, how they think, we can predict their actions and reactions. So we can motivate them more easily and negotiate with them with more success. So as you can see, empathy is very important, not just in experience design, but as a core human quality, uh, particularly in the business, living your life, being able to deal with your parents and your siblings and people around you. So that leads us to empathy mapping. Empathy maps allow us to understand a person from multiple viewpoints in relation to the service. It is a template or canvas that synthesizes the results of user observation and shows it in a systematic way. Based on the results of the user observation, insights can be drawn and user needs can be identified, which can also be included in the map. Empathy mapping is used in the beginning of the design process while we are attempting to understand the users, and also during the prototype validation phase where we observe the users while they are using the design service. And when we talk about service here, for the most part, we're talking about interfaces. As I'd said previously, um, experience design can cover a wide number of fields, In this class in particular, we're focusing on interface design. So when you see me talk about things like services or anything like that, that's what we're talking about. It is a great design tool because it allows you to focus on certain aspects while observing users. It quickly visualizes the information in a useful way so insights can be drawn. Sorry, I didn't write that slide out very well. It can be used in more parts of the design process uh, during the very beginning or during prototyping. So empathy mapping can be broken down into 4 sections. And those 4 sections are, what does the person using the interface say? What do they do? So doing, you have to pay attention not just to the words they're saying, but how they're acting. If they're, scrolling over the page and their mouse is darting from one navigation item to the next, you can infer that they're uncertain about what the next step is in the process. Think, what might the user be thinking? What are their beliefs? You can usually get what the user is thinking by asking them questions. So if you see that they're confused, you can say, well, what's confusing you right now? So empathy mapping is not just about watching people doing something. It's about inquiring, speaking to them, talking to them, and asking questions. Feel, what emotions might the user feel? So this one's a little bit harder. This is about using empathy in particular. You can ask them what they're feeling, but sometimes they may not know themselves. So what we're trying to do with the empathy mapping, process is to pay attention to them and pay attention to their body language and the things that they're indicating with maybe they're grunting with displeasure or something along those lines. What we want to do is capture what you think they may be feeling. Of course, you can ask them to. You can go like, you look very upset right now. What emotions are you feeling? But all this means we have to pay very close attention to the person that's doing that we're observing for the empathy mapping exercise. To show you what an empathy map looks like, they can look like all kinds of things, but this is the basic layout. Um, the idea is the user is in the center, and there's quadrants. There's 4 quadrants, and it says, thinks, does, feels. Um, and the way you normally do this empathy mapping exercise is you, roughly sketch these quadrants out and you label them, and you write in there what in the says quadrant you write what the user says. In the thinks quadrant you write what the user's thinking. In the does quadrant, what they do. In the feels quadrant, what you think they feel. Excuse me. Um, so pretty straightforward. Um, when you're doing the empathy mapping exercise, you'll probably want to do this, on a piece of paper and write it down in handwriting. I would like for the final presentation of your empathy map in the presentation format, like I've asked for, to be done in a digital format. So I'd like you to throw it in Illustrator or Photoshop or whatever and make it look nice. It should be presentable. What to look out for when creating an empathy map. When we do empathy mapping exercises, we are attempting to empathize with our users and discover what they have difficulty with in an experience. This difficulty could be confusion about what to do next, too many steps to get to the intended goal, general frustration with how to use the interface, basically anything that requires users to stop and think about what they're doing. Oh, I should be a bit more general about how you do empathy mapping. So let's go back to this slide. So what is the empathy map about? Well, like I said, uh, this class is experience design, and we're going to be focused on interfaces in particular. So what I'm going to be asking you to do is to choose a website. Now, to make things easier for yourself, choose a website that is difficult to use. Um, that will make it easier for you. If you find a website that's absolutely a pleasure to use, then you're going to get less feedback from the user. Um, the you need to the way you get this whole process started is you sit down the user in front of the website and you give them a task. You give them a specific task. If you're too general, you're not going to get useful information. So if it's a ride sharing uh, application, you will ask the user to book a ride to a certain destination. And then you will watch them as they use the app and see when they experience good things, when they do things that are easy, and then also, more importantly, when they run into trouble. Kind of capturing those pain points is in areas of friction. That's what we're looking for as experienced designers. So I mentioned user frustration. I don't know why I say frustration instead of frustration. It's a bit of a tongue twister. Um, these terms, they're often used in the industry. Pain points, friction, cognitive load. They're all kind of the same thing, and they can be used for the most part interchangeably. A pain point is obviously where like a user is experiencing pain. Uh, I think pain's too dramatic for it. I think most, you know, user difficulties can be described as friction. Or my favorite one is cognitive load. Now it sounds very fancy, but cognitive load is a way to describe what happens to user they've they've been required to think too much about something. So let me just read this to you. So cognitive load, like computers, human brains have a limited amount of processing power. When the amount of information coming in exceeds our ability to handle it, our performance suffers. We may take longer to understand information, miss important details, or even get overwhelmed and abandon the task. I will go a little bit further than this definition. So this is when, so basically we have making decisions takes up mental energy. And every day, from the moment we wake up till the moment we go to bed, we're making hundreds of decisions. And the more decisions we make in the course of the day, the more we run out of energy to make decisions. Like it takes mental energy to make real choices. And that's why sometimes we just glide through things and kind of get the default coffee and, you know, croissant in the morning or whatever. We have like a morning routine. We do that because it reduces our ability to have to make decisions all the time. And so, when we're looking at a website or an app and we're trying to use it, especially if it's the first time, we often have to make many decisions that we've never had to make before. And those decisions cost mental energy. And our job as experienced designers is to reduce the number of times we ask a user to do this. We want to smooth it off, reduce the friction, and reduce the cognitive load. So, how do you reduce cognitive load? We're jumping a bit ahead here, but I think it's worthwhile now that we're talking about it. Don't present too much to the user at once. So, don't overwhelm people. When you go into, you have to fill in a form for the government and it's got a million uh, fields on it, it can be feel like a daunting task. Hide extra settings from most users. You'll see that in most modern apps. There'll be advanced settings, and that's where all the kind of more complicated settings are. This reduces the amount of options presented to the user. It makes it easier to use. Build on existing metaphors. So this means if there's a navigation metaphor that's well accepted, like for example, on mobile devices, you will have um, on mobile devices you'll have what's called a hamburger menu. There are three horizontal lines. When you click on those lines, there's a menu inside. Uh, First time you use it, you have to click on it to find out what it is. But once you've done it once, you understand what its purpose is. And so that's an existing metaphor because people are used to it now. They don't have to question it. They understand how it works. Use sensible defaults to reduce user tasks. So that means your website or your application should be set up by default to be generally the most useful for most users. Split menu items into subsections. So if there's too many generalized menu items, you can cut them into subsections to make them more readable and more understandable. Those are just a few ways of reducing cognitive load. There's a ton more, and we'll be covering them over the course of the semester. Point of view statement. So the part of your first assignment beyond creating the empathy map is to create a point of view statement from the information you gleaned from the empathy map. A point of view statement is a very specific way to state a challenge, and it's used in experience design. So let's go over that quickly. So it's good to create a chart that says user, so you can identify the user, their needs, and the insight. So for example, let's talk about Humber parking. So being a teacher and having to park at Humber, it's a mess. It's very difficult to understand how the whole parking situation works. And I just pay for parking, because I'm not there every day. I just pay at the parking lot. But I heard from other students that the getting parking permits and figuring out where to park is a huge confusing mess, and the website doesn't make it easy. So, if we identify the user is a Humber student, their needs to find out how to park at Humber, especially if it's their first year there. In the insight, there should be something interesting in the insight, something that you learned from the empathy mapping exercise. So parking can be difficult to find at Humber's campus. Going to college can be stressful at the best of times. Students need a way to find parking that is easy and reliable. So, I've added in the empathy here is understanding that, just being a student is stressful enough, and you need ways to reduce this kind of stress, this cognitive load on students. So that would be the insight I would glean from doing an empathy map, right? I didn't even do an empathy map for this. I just know it from my lectures and speaking to the students. And I was able to empathize with their experience by talking to them. So the way that you translate this into a point, this isn't the statement itself. This is a way to kind of conceptualize it. But what you have to do with this is you take this information that's in this chart here and you put it into a sentence. So you identify the user, Humber student. The more specific you can be with the user, the better. If it's a mom of 3 kids, you can put that in there, anything along those lines. Humber student needs, so we're figuring out what they need. A way to view parking options in a way that makes sense. So you state what the problem is. Because, and this is where you put the insight, parking is already difficult at Humber and students are stressed out. The one thing, this is my next slide. The one important thing to note is the point of view statement is to identify the challenge that you've acquired through having empathy and not to provide the solution, not yet. So I know that in my previous classes, students sometimes actually kind of stuck the solution in there. And even though you might have a very good idea of what some of the solutions are after doing the empathy mapping and viewing the person using the website, the point of view statement is not for that purpose. It's to be used as a starting point for ideation on how you make it better. So you're trying to identify the challenge for the user. That's why I tell you to give the user a specific task, because a website or application might have many, many user flows, and there might be issues with all those user flows. So this thing is, the point of view statement is always the thing that's a little bit challenging for the students. They never seem to quite get it, and I admit it is a bit of a tricky thing. The important thing, and what I'll mark you on, is that if I can see some insight in what you're writing there, if it isn't just this website should be easier because it's hard, that's not a great POV. If you can give me some kind of insight into what your user was thinking in the POV statement, I will accept that as a good point of view statement. Affinity mapping. So this is just one of the other forms of research, and actually in our previous classes, like last year, this was one of the assignments. This one I find actually pretty useful, especially for information architecture. So the way it works is, and I won't spend too much time on this, my lectures are already too long. It involves sticky notes. And so what you do is you pose a question, and just a very simplistic kind of example of what I've asked in the past is I get the students to write down snack foods on their sticky notes. After they spend like 10 minutes writing down snack foods on their sticky notes, I put them up on the whiteboard and then we start grouping them. And you start to see natural groupings that you may not have understood before. There was, when I asked about snacking, I didn't expect that there would be a natural division between snacks that are good for you and bad for you. So that was like one potential grouping. Then the snacks can be grouped about, whether they're sweet or savory, et cetera, et cetera. So you can see where we're going with that. And the reason why you do it in sticky notes is quite often you have to move them around and regroup them as you start building groups and then bigger meta groups. So that's the gist of what affinity mapping is. I'm going to go through in a little bit more detail right now, but I wanted to kind of just say in my own words how it worked. The affinity, oh yeah, affinity mapping is also called affinity diagramming or the affinity diagram. So those terms are used interchangeably. The affinity diagram organizes a large number of ideas into their natural relationships. It is organized output from a brainstorming session. Use it to generate, organize, and consolidate information related to a product, process, complex issue, or problem. After generating ideas, group them according to their affinity or similarity. The idea creation method taps a team's creativity and intuition. Step 1, record each idea with a marking pen on a separate sticky note or card. So yeah, sticky notes are the way to do this. And you can either hand out the stickies and get the group to do it, or somebody can stand in the front and have people shout it out and they write it down. Step 2, look for ideas that seem to be related in some way and place them side by side. So this is a way of creating groupings in physical space. That makes sense based on what we're seeing that's coming out of the brainstorm. Usually, the thing that's interesting about this is you usually find groupings that aren't expected. And that is the interesting insight. And that's the power of this tool. Step 3, begin a discussion with your team. So, as you're putting these up there, as you start talking about your team, and then you might realize you're creating one grouping that is too narrow or too limited, and actually you can join two groupings together to make a more sensible grouping. So that's the kind of fluid back and forth that happens during affinity mapping. It should be, if you're doing affinity mapping and everything's just going right into one thing or another, you're probably not pushing it enough. You should push it a little bit deeper to find out what other kinds of groupings exist there. And step 4, combine groups into supergroups if appropriate. So you might have developed micro groups, like you might, for example, with my snack food example, you might have subgroupings like gelatinous for gummy bears or what have you. But then you might end up seeing that they're actually part of the sweet supergroup rather than not in the savory supergroup. So the groupings, and that doesn't mean you break apart the gelatinous grouping. It just means that that grouping goes inside the sweet supergroup. Affinity mapping is often used to create navigation groupings for websites. Surprisingly, this is not always self-evident. So like I was saying before, and this is usually the kind of thing that would be considered what an information architect does. And we've used it before you can use it for new websites, but what we found it particularly powerful for is that sometimes there's websites that are content managed, and over years and years of use, the navigation gets out of control. People are just inserting sections into different places that don't make sense. So with those kind of sites, you can go and you can write down all the content areas that you see in the site, and then you can start doing your own grouping to make it into a more logical navigation. So, you have a top level navigation, you have like home, careers, projects, etc., etc. You can use affinity mapping for grouping together different pieces of sub-content into a larger grouping. And that is the end of it. So it's taco time. Thank you very much for your attention and watching this video, and I will see you all in class this week.